Hi, my name is Dr. Gary Simmons, and this is part 2 in a series, A New Funding Model for Evolving Out of Our Sense of Not Enough. It's about a second-tier strategy for transitioning to mission-centric ministry and looking at the need that we still have to support our ministries as we move into that transition. And when we're dealing in such a chaotic environment where not enough is kind of our driver for attempting new funding strategies, we need to look at something that is more comprehensive with respect to integrating and aligning ourselves with these chaotic times and moving into a strategy that really is sustainable. I wish to state on the onset that I'm not making a case against teaching tithing as a spiritual practice. I'm merely stating that the context in which we present those teachings are no longer sustaining our ministries. And since the last 30 years, things have changed, and so it's important for us to understand these changes and how it impacts our capacity to be both relevant and sustainable in our efforts to fulfill our purpose. And so as we look at our funding strategy and have a sense that things are different, we also need to understand that these times and the context out of which we're sort of compelled and driven in our life and in our world by the story of separation, these are all factors that are participating in the reason why there's such urgency about looking at new innovative ways to not only inform our ministry practice but also sustain us financially in this changing, ever-changing world. So I'd also like to present an integrity issue with respect to the whole dynamic of our tithing-based funding system. So whenever we decide to offer or teach or schedule a tithing class, and as we look at the context for our intent behind that, it's very common that we do so in the context of our organizational not enough. In other words, our intention for teaching prosperity principles is included in that, not only equipping our community with spiritual principles that are effective at bringing forth an increase in people's lives, but there's something out of integrity with us doing that because organizationally we're dealing with not enough. Now, we've been able to do that for a number of years very successfully and with some sense of being in integrity with our efforts because we've spiritualized the tradition of tithing. And as we examine the actual biblical context out of which we have kind of aligned with Christianity's kind of rebranding of the principle of tithing in the context of funding our organizations, as we sort of understand that that's what we've inherited, and we have basically grown up with that as being our funding practice. We need to understand now that there are conditions that are affecting the efficacy of that program, one of which is that no longer can we be in integrity with teaching a tithing class where we are requiring people to tithe back to us 10%, ostensibly because we are their source of spiritual nourishment. We cannot, in integrity, kind of be in that practice without considering that what does it say about us as ministry leaders when we are looking to our congregation for our sense of well-being and worth. In other words, as they respond to the tradition of participating in our funding tradition, and that is tithe to where you're spiritually fed, what we're discovering is that people are discovering that they're spiritually fed in a number of different ways. And so inevitably, especially in the minister-centric model of ministry, when there's a sense of not enough, it can also be linked to how people feel connected or not in relationship to their ministry, because if you've ever had the experience of not being spiritually fed when you're in a relationship with an experience where that was the expectation, it probably cast a shadow as to whether or not that moment warranted the kind of effort that typically we just take for granted when we're in a kind of unconscious tithing practice. And so what happens in ministries, especially when there's drama or there's an exacerbation of the story of separation, when we're looking around at each other for the reasons why there's so much discomfort or things not happening the way that we want it, we're kind of sourcing our discomfort as well as sourcing our source outside of ourselves. And this is all exacerbated by both these times and both our ill-equipped funding model to really assist us in really applying spiritual principle in overcoming the insufficiency that we are experiencing, and that is exacerbated by our story of separation. And so my assertion is that unless we teach prosperity principles independent of any kind of strategy to get more, we are inadvertently creating a kind of malpractice by requiring tithing back as a condition of participation. And so let us just say, what would happen if we just didn't say where to tithe back to? That we can teach a tithing class and invite people to tithe to where they're spiritually fed, but just don't stipulate it has to come back to the ministry. And wouldn't that be an interesting experiment to see if it comes back? And the other side of it is that we should understand that we're wanting people to learn how to tithe as source, not to be able we're not wanting to teach people to look outside of themselves for their own sense of well-being and worth, for their own sense of increase. We want the increase to be experienced as an effect of an internal way of being in our life and with what we're having. And while that is an easy way for us to reframe our current prosperity teachings, when we shift into tithing as source, we begin to bring people back into a connection with the dimension of themselves that is infinite and eternal, the dimension of themselves that is connected to the divine matrix, to this sense of interbeing that's extricated from the story of separation. And so one gives from that place that is not tethered to any outer condition or circumstance, but simply as an extension of one's effort to be congruent with who they are and what they're here to see flourish. And so our effort is to teach people how to be source unto their own life, and to come into a sense of empowerment, as opposed to being in our ministry as this participant that is waiting for something great to happen. Ken Wilber would always say that the process of moving to the next level is all about transcend and include. And so we want to transcend the elements of our tithing-based funding practice that exacerbate our financial stability. And we also want to, though, include those elements of the tithing principle that really support our movement towards mission-centric ministry. And tithing as source is such a second-tier practice. And so we'll have more to say about that. It's just important for us that part of this whole work is to recontext how we're being in our experience of ministry. And that recontexting is moving out of the story of separation and into the awareness of our interconnection, our oneness, our sense of understanding life as a living system, and that all aspects of our experience have contributing factors that exist in consciousness and in our way of being with what is happening in our life. And so if our ministry practice has conditioned a way of being in our financial relationship with what's happening in our ministry, we will try the same efforts over and over and over again to try to deal with our sense of not enough. But is not the principle that to him who has, more shall be given, but to him who has not, even that which he has shall be taken away? And so whenever we feel separate from our greater good, whenever it seems to be it's out there or it has to be coaxed, that sense of separation exacerbates our capacity to draw into our life the greater good that is necessary for us to fulfill our purpose. And so it's simply about reorienting ourselves in the context of what we're about as new thought spiritual beings, in the context of leading our organizations into a sustainable organizational paradigm, second-tier organizational practice. And so we need to understand that this is not something that's just going to happen to us. We have to actually create the pathway into this new funding principle that transcends the limitations of both the sense of not enough and the story of separation. And so that's what we're moving towards in this look at evolving out of our sense of not enough. For now, I'm wanting us to seriously consider what's going on in our world and how these conditions and times necessitate an urgency to address the inadequacies of our current funding practice, lest we forget the unintended consequences of our minister-centric ministry practice. I'll come back to this issue in part 3, where I will share details of this new funding model based on second-tier principles and the concept of interbeing. Now let's take a look at what's going on in congregational ministries across denominational lines. Alban Institute founder Loren Mead in 1974 actually predicted the gradual decline of congregational ministries. And this is why he founded the Alban Institute, to turn the tide against this decline. However, in 2014, the Alban Institute, the nation's most experienced church growth and development consulting and publishing enterprise, closed its doors. The Alban Institute's decline and closure signals a troublesome development in the church industry. They went out of business because they're unable to turn the tide of decline. It's simply that obvious. Depending upon the source, 9 out of 10 churches are in decline or are struggling to maintain the status quo. At our recent Unity Worldwide Summit, Board Chair Richard Bunch has acknowledged these disheartening developments. The Episcopal Church has lost 30% of its congregational ministries. The Presbyterian denomination has lost 40% of its congregations. In New Thought, I estimate that 25% of our ministries have closed in the last 15 years. 85% of all congregations in the U.S. are less than 100 participants, and that number is more in New Thought, probably closer to 90%. Keep in mind that decline means so much more than just simply dwindling numbers. It can mean significant changes in the well-being of congregations as they come to terms with the insufficiency on many different fronts. I mean, just think about it. What happens when you're experiencing a financial crisis and it impacts your staff and it impacts your community? It's not without consequence, our sense of not enough and our inability to turn the tide against these forces that are underlying the gradual decline of our ministries. And so it's important for us to understand, suffice to say that if 9 out of 10 churches are preoccupied with survival and making ends meet, living month to month like many who are in our communities, if this is the backdrop of our transformative message and our efforts to inspire people to make a positive difference in our world, can we not see that if this is what's going on in the midst of our trying to do the job of ministering to our community and serving the greater good, and yet we're struggling with trying to fund our organizations, can we not see that we're a house divided against ourselves? And that we need to create a different way that we can be in the experience of what's happening in this world and still be able to feel empowered and capable of thriving, especially in these times. And so that's where we're moving towards. If as ministry leaders we're unable to use our spiritual practices and principles to extricate ourselves out of these very trends that currently consume our energy and the well-being of congregations across North America, for me what this says is either our spiritual practices and principles don't work, or that we have yet to align and welcome the disruption that is associated and integral to these times, because it is the very conditions that necessitate our engaging emergence as a means by which we can transcend the limitations of this current story of separation and what's going on in our world. And we can free ourselves from the entanglement of the unsustainable ministry practice, the pastor-flock model of ministry. And you will see in part 3 that we can do this. Not only is it possible for us to do this, we must do this. This is something that we must embrace, we must engage, because it is calling us to live consciously in our intention to co-create a world that works for everyone. Can we not see that that's what's up for us? The capacity to model and to demonstrate what is possible when a community enters intentionally into the story of our interconnection, of our interbeing, and aligns with that story in all aspects of its organization and community life and creates a coherent around that intent. Can we not see how it's possible for us to be able to bring into our experience a greater good without having to manipulate or control what's happening in the outer to bring that greater good forth? It's about us deciding how we're going to be with what we're having and creating a coherence around doing something that's in alignment with our effort to bring forth the story of our interconnection, as opposed to insulate ourselves from our experience of separation and not enough. Isn't that worthy of our effort to look at all the things that are necessary for us to really own our capacity to determine how we're going to be in these times and to create our greater good, to move towards that possibility. Right now, a different funding model seems impossible, but that's the very reason why we have to embrace moving forward. And so I've touched on the inevitable aging out of baby boomers and the traditionals. Mainline Protestant leaders have actually calculated how much time we have left before the entire industry of congregational ministry is destined to cease if an alternative funding model hasn't manifested soon. Here it is. 23 Easters are left. 23 Easters. So I'll be 90 years old in 23 Easters from now. How old will you be? And I don't know about you, but I think that we're going to have some plan that helps us continue beyond 2040, because I plan to be totally probably on Margaritaville to watch this unfold. So anyway, the point is that we're really dealing with something that actually has been looked at as something that has a kind of closure to it. So if nothing drastic or dramatic happens in the world, can we count on 23 more years left to figure out something to do as a fix? Well, no, not really, because we probably really don't have 23 years. And so it's important for us to look at what might accelerate that process. And so have you heard about the nuns? This is a growing demographic of adults who have nothing to do with organized religion. The percentage of these adults in this category has increased from 20 years ago to about 8%, and where it is now, over 25%. So one quarter of all adults that are out there don't have anything to do with organized religions. Now, these are atheists, they're agnostics, they're secular humanists. The point is that they're not engaging. They're not engaging in a spiritual community. And then there are the duns. These are typically the baby boomers who are exiting congregational ministry, and that exit is increasing. And they're not really, they don't really have a problem with congregational ministry or the minister-centric model of ministry. They're just tired. They're tired of the plop, pray, and pay model of ministry, which is what minister-centric model of ministry can become. Of course, these trends remind us of the need to attract new people, and especially young people, into our congregations so that we can cultivate the next wave of leaders to help us grow beyond the year 2040. This is why we sometimes think that the millennials will bring new energy and resources into our community. And while we are attracting some millennials and some of those who are in the new Generation Z, we have yet to unlock the rocket science, the secret behind tapping this field of creativity and authenticity. And so while we are attracting these people, the challenge of really engaging the younger demographic authentically has many obstacles to overcome. So just imagine this. Imagine what it would be like to go to a millennials worship service. I mean, if there is such a thing. I mean, just imagine what would be the felt experience of that kind of dynamic. What would be their music, their liturgy, their rituals, their customs? How would we as baby boomers or traditionalists feel when we walk into their congregation? Would it be a fit for us? What would be your effort to try to fit in to their worship experience? And yet, we place the effort of their fitting in with us upon them as opposed to us trying to meet them halfway. But what if the message of this new paradigm of funding our ministry is so aligned with where millennials want to go all in around? What if we could actually engage millennials not as a funding source or a resource, but actually engaging millennials as a way and young people as a way of really bringing them into ownership of what we're trying to create together as a fulfillment of our mission and purpose. And so we want young people, we want their energy, their resourcefulness, their creativity, but our ministry practice is not aligned with their demographic. And if we don't understand that that's the case, then our efforts to kind of move in that direction will be confusing. It'll be incoherent. It won't be sustainable. Finally, as tithes and love offerings fall short for meeting expenses, we do what we have to do in order to make ends meet, to make it work. And so in part 3, we'll be looking at some of the things that we do because there are things that we can do to help deal with the insufficiency of our tithing-based funding model. But oftentimes those things that we do to make up for the shortfall, it lives outside of our effort to fulfill our purpose. And so the things that become opportunities for us to generate income move us into a different category of being. And so, for instance, we may become landlords, property managers, fundraisers, marketers. There's all kinds of things that we become that are in perfect order in the context of the story of separation when we need to get more. And so we're going to acknowledge that this is sort of what we must do in order to manage these times. But nonetheless, we need to see that it's as if there's a kind of dial. And so on the one hand, we've been so dependent upon the dial of this tithing-based paradigm of funding our ministries to kind of be full on, but at the same time, as this has been dialing back and becoming insufficient, our effort to make up the difference through fundraisers and through cost-cutting measures and through leasing our facilities out or selling our property or changing ministerial leadership. There's all kinds of things that we're doing to try to make sure that we're leveraging all that we have in order to get more. But I gotta tell you, there's a different way. So stay tuned to part 3 and we'll explore that different way.